So, welcome to Fashion Roundtable's first book club. We're here today with Daisy Fancourt. Daisy is a professor at UCL, and she's the director of the World Health Organization Collaborating Centre on Arts and Health, as well as an expert scientific advisor to DCMS, so no pressure for me. Daisy's published over 250 peer-reviewed papers and is the author of Art Cure, which is the first book that we are covering today. And it's a Sunday Times bestseller and longlisted for the Women's Prize for Nonfiction as well, which is absolutely amazing. Welcome, Daisy.
Thank you. It's so lovely to be with you.
Oh, and a big congratulations on your book. I think the timing of this feels particularly poignant, particularly after sort of years of austerity. And then, after sort of the pandemic, I think that was when people started putting together I suppose, the well-being sort of effects of participating in the arts and, craft particularly. So you're one of the most highly cited scientists in the world, but where did your passion for how social connections and behaviours impact on health and well-being first begin?
It actually began from an unexpected place. I come from a family of musicians, and therefore I really thought that I would head into the professional music world as well. I trained as a pianist. But then I got an incredible opportunity to work part-time in hospitals delivering arts programs. And it was just so powerful an experience, actually being able to see the benefits that the arts were having. And I'd always had this passion for science. And I actually went into the NHS initially after that, designing arts programs. But then I really was just fascinated about what I was seeing and being able to quantify it. So I left completely retrained with multiple new degrees in science. And now I get the pleasure and privilege of actually getting to try and research and evidence this more through my work.
I mean, that's amazing. That's quite a journey that you've been on then, from sort of starting as a musician and all the way through now to obviously social science research projects. I suppose so for those who might be joining and haven't actually sort of read the book or haven't had a chance to get to the end of it, can you give us a summary of the book and then, tell us sort of, what it covers, what can people expect when they start reading your book?
So we've had so many books over the last few years that tell us about really important behaviors for our health, like physical activity, diet, sleep, nature. And the whole point of Art Cure is to present the equivalent book for talking about the arts, because the arts are a health behavior in their own right. When we engage in the arts, it has really tangible effects on our minds, brains, bodies, and behavior. So the book brings all of this evidence together alongside real life case stories and examples of people who've delivered programs and benefited from them. And also what I call the daily dose, a kind of recommendation section at the end of each chapter for what individuals can do in their own lives to put this evidence into practice and experience the health benefits of the arts.
Okay, so if somebody started sort of reading this, and I'm going to get into social prescribing and a few questions that people have actually sort of written in a little bit on the sort of your daily dose aspect. How much is a daily dose that we should be sort of, I suppose, sort of participating in? Like, how can we reach sort of maximum benefits with this? You're saying sort of a dose.
Well, one important thing to realize is that even microdosing on the arts for even a few minutes has health benefits. Like if we're feeling really stressed, for example, and we take the time to listen to a piece of music or to look at a piece of art or to engage in something ourselves, we can see directly impacts on that psychologically and also physiologically in the body. But if you're interested in health outcomes, for example, reductions in symptoms of depression or improvements in well-being, or you actually want to have health benefits that will last years or decades afterwards, then the most important thing is having a regular behavior that we engage in. So a bit like we have a kind of 5 a day rule for getting fruits and vegetables, I recommend that people pick what their equivalent is, whether that's 10, 15, 20 minutes a day that they try and make space for, and also try if they can once a week to find a longer slot, like an hour long class or something that they can have regularly to go to, because we see very, very clearly that having that more intensive hour on a weekly basis leads to very tangible effects in the medium and also the long term.
I mean, that's incredible, isn't it? Because I don't need an excuse to to microdose on the arts, but I know that it's hard for some people to sort of fit in. So even if you're having that small dose, there's still what you're saying is there's still sort of well-being benefits. I think, can you delve further into sort of the effects on our overall health? So what is actually happening sort of biologically when we're sort of engaging in the arts?
Well, let's say you're doing something like reading a book or listening to a piece of music or doing some crafting. Whilst you're doing that, within the brain, you're activating regions right at the heart of the brain involved in our pleasure response and activating net reward networks like the dopaminergic system, which leads to the release of neurotransmitters like dopamine that help you to feel happy. You're also activating your stress response system. So if you're reading something that's relaxing you or listening to a relaxing piece of music, that's sending messages along your autonomic nervous system, so the nerves across your body, reducing your heart rate and your blood pressure. It's also altering the balance of hormones in your endocrine system, like reducing levels of the stress hormone cortisol. And it's even doing things like affecting levels of inflammation in your immune system, which relate to your mood, and even changing patterns of gene expression, which are controlling so many other physiological functions in the body. So it really is a whole brain and body workout engaging in the arts.
I mean, that's amazing. So, in terms of engaging, do you think that it's enough just to go to, say, an art gallery or a museum? Or do you think that we should also be sort of using our hands and doing something more tangible to get these health benefits?
Well, again, it's a bit like our diet. We know that different vegetables and fruits and components of our diet each have different effects on our health. And it's the same with the arts. Like when we are more receptively engaging and watching things, for example, we're getting the benefits of things like narrative storylines, for example, which are really
Yeah,
important for our brains. If we are participating, we're getting more of a kind of tactile engagement. We're having to exercise our own creativity and imagination, which then brings different ingredients for us. And if we're learning new skills, then we're testing other cognitive processes. So I think the best advice is really to have a mix of different things that we do. And that's also really beneficial because if we do the same thing repeatedly, sometimes we can start to have a bit of a saturation effect from it. It's called the hedonic treadmill. We tend to kind of adapt to it and not
yeah.
necessarily keep getting the same benefits. But if we're mixing things up and bringing novelty in, then it helps it to stay fresh and helps to renew the benefits you get.
That's interesting. So it's about sort of partaking in, a variety then of arts-based sort of and craft activities, is what you're saying.
Exactly, yes.
Okay. And then I thought in the book, some of the real world examples that you were given were sort of poignant. And when I was reading them, felt, like I felt quite connected to some of the characters that you were sort of talking to. And I know that you've done a lot of research around, for example, those living with dementia, to those suffering from poor mental health. And I've used crafting quite a bit in my own recovery journey from long COVID. So I could kind of relate to that when you were saying it. Um, is there a specific example that you've written about that that you'd like to share that would, give that example to our audience?
I think I want to highlight as well that these characters, they're all real people and even real names, which I know is actually quite unusual in books. Normally there's a big
Yeah.
concern
Yeah.
about anonymity, but I was really lucky in this. I wanted to share real stories so it's authentic, and I'm very grateful to the individuals who were happy to be involved. One of my personal favorites is a man called Josh. He had cerebral palsy that caused him one-sided paralysis on one side of his body. And as a young child, he was told to do hour after hour of hand therapy exercises to try and strengthen his hand function. But that's not really what young children want to do. So he actually instead got to take part in a program which was called Breathe Magic, where they brought together occupational therapists, artists, and magic circle magicians who turned every hand therapy exercise into a magic trick. And also through the concept of him attending a magic camp, they also worked on things like confidence and self-esteem and eye contact and communication and social support. And Josh went on this program and just he said it was completely transformative for him. Not only major improvements in his hand function, but also new peer support, new confidence. It really triggered an upward spiral in his whole life. And he kept practicing his magic tricks afterwards and actually started getting seriously good at
Oh, we just lost Daisy for a moment.
circle stage
We just
at
lost
the
you, Daisy.
Circle in London.
Oh,
Am I
we
back
just
with
lost
you
you
now?
for a second. You're back, yeah. No, you were just saying that, he'd got really good at magic.
Yes, and he started being invited as a mentor on the program and also to give professional magic shows with the Magic Circle magicians. And eventually he got invited to perform at the Magic Circle. And they didn't actually tell him, but they invited the Board of Examiners along and they treated his performance as the exam. And he passed. So he's now a fully fledged member of the Elite Magic Circle.
I mean, that is just such a heartwarming story, isn't it? And all from, like, engaging in, the arts, basically, and I suppose there's that sense of community and everything else that comes with it that we're really lacking at the moment, especially in terms of, how AI is, particularly sort of ruling the roost at the moment in terms of, creativity, and people are quite concerned about how it's sort of, not only taking jobs, but also it's impacting on our, levels of community, etc. Do you think that AI is something that we need to watch out for? I know that you've spoken about digital art, like for example, being a little bit like ultra processed food, and what should we be looking out for with that?
I do think it's important wherever possible for our own arts engagement to be non-screen based because we know that the screen based element seems to dilute the health benefits that we see from arts engagement. So that's not to say that there aren't still values of things like watching dramas on television, for example, or engaging virtually with arts activities, but it's just good to be cognizant of trying to get as much offline as possible. With regards to AI, I think there is a threat here to the whole arts industry because we're suddenly handing
Yeah.
over an entire skill set. Even though sometimes people argue that we're handing over the more routine aspects, you can still have elite artists doing their work. We forget that actually it's often the routine things like creating designs of brochures or developing background music for something. That's actually how many artists train and how they build up the skills to become more elite. I'm also not sure it's the right thing for us as a species because AI actually isn't as good at the kind of divergent creative processes that arts involves, at being able to shock us and give us new perspectives on things. It often predicts what's most likely to occur. But also, I'm not sure why we want to do this because surely with AI, we should be giving it the tasks that we don't want to do so we can actually spend time on the things that are more enjoyable, engaging, like the arts.
Completely agree. Yeah, I totally agree with you. Um, and I think the other thing is, we had a question in, so thinking about this is from Jody. So thinking about culture for health and daily doses, um, from which other countries can we learn sort of best practice on this, without losing our own cultural practices and utilizing the abundance of what we have? Spaces, artists, creators in this country. A lot of these personal research has led to Sweden and Finland for fitness, health, sensory, neurodivergent well-being, for example. She's wondering if you've found those countries of relevance too. Um, yeah, what are your thoughts on that?
A lot of the countries that I'm looking to a lot at the moment are in the global south, because actually we find that in the global north, quite a lot arts engagement has been commodified and it's been turned into a luxury, the sort of payment barriers to access for lots of people. Whereas
Yeah.
actually it's in many global south countries, we still see that the arts are actually inherently interwoven within everyday life, ritual, and community practice. And that's really what we need so that we're not separating it out as a kind of leisure behavior, but it's actually just part of our day to day involvements. If we look to children, actually, they're the perfect example of this because children don't engage in arts at pre-specified time points. They're just constantly singing and dancing and telling stories and acting things out and crafting. And that's really how we should be aiming with our own practice, that it's just something that we are being as creative as possible in our day-to-day activities. That said, that can require sort of interventions to support us. And I think there are some really lovely ones around the world that are giving us food for thought about how to even out access. So, for example, in Brazil, they've got a lovely program which offers arts vouchers to low income families to ensure that they can still engage. So it's not something that's just for wealthier families. In Egypt, they've got some really nice book schemes, like community book schemes, to ensure there's that availability. Uh,
We've just lost Daisy again. Hopefully, we'll get her back in just a sec. You there,
I am
Daisy?
here. Can you see me, Meg?
Yeah.
I was just saying that we need to invest more in our libraries and things to support that. And Japan has some lovely work around like ring fencing arts funding each time there are infrastructure builds to ensure there's really nice artistic design everywhere.
I mean, there's some really really good examples that we can sort of lean on for that, I think. Kind of going into this, so you were talking about how children specifically naturally engage in the arts just out of habit, and I think they seem a lot happier than most adults because of it, in my opinion. And my daughter's school, interestingly, in Wales, has done a whole term of arts participation in the community. The entire school at all different levels have participated in some way, which has been lovely, and she's gone in a lot happier and home a lot happier, I have to say. Um, but what I wanted to talk to you about was, you cite that in sort of 2022, the overall budget for the arts made up just 0.1% of the per pupil budget in schools. And so, can you expand on how important a STEAM education is in childhood? And then, does this affect how likely children are to participate in the arts as adults?
So, with that last point first, yes, it really increases the likelihood that children will participate as adults if they've had that exposure in childhood. But unfortunately, if they get that exposure outside school, it's heavily dependent on the socio-demographic profiles of their parents. So, school is actually the great leveler here to giving all children access. In terms of the benefits, we see really tangible benefits in terms of reductions in the development of behavioural problems amongst young people who've got arts access from a very young age. We see improvements in various aspects of cognitive, particularly linguistic developments. We also see improvements in things like mental health, so reduced risk of young people developing mental health problems if
Yeah,
they're engaged in the arts. And also lots of pro-social benefits as well, like social support networks. There's also, though, benefits from an industry perspective. A lot of the skills that are going to be most important in the next generation for the workplace are around creativity and curiosity, which are, of course, exactly what the arts provide. So I really feel that we should be acknowledging all of these effects and trying to ensure that arts education is actually compulsory and available to all young people rather than it being the kind of optional add-on that it currently seems to be.
yeah, I agree. And it's that critical thinking skills as well, which come with that sort of arts sort
Mhm.
of training. And I think that we're at a point where, we've done a lot of work on encouraging a STEAM education back into schools. And I know that Wales and Scotland have taken that on
Mhm.
board, but I think England is still slightly behind. I think you touched on an interesting point about sort of um, social deprivation just then, and how access to the arts is difficult for some, communities, especially if you're rural or if you're living in areas of sort of deprivation in the UK. And I know you said about, putting more funding into libraries, etc. What else could we do to, even out that access issues?
I think a lot of it is around access to community spaces where arts groups can be held. So making sure that there are publicly available, essentially cultural venues or community centres. It's
Yeah.
also important that we maintain free access. I've been quite concerned in the last week seeing a lot of headlines around whether museums are going to start charging again in the UK, which feels like it would be a major backward step because even if the amounts are made sort of what's perceived to be low costs, that's often enough to be able to preclude many people from engaging. And also, there's a behavioural point here. If there's any charge at all, people are less likely to walk through those doors, particularly if you've got children, because everyone knows that children's attention spans in museums and galleries can really fluctuate. So you'll probably find families just simply not thinking it's worth the investment in case their kids don't want to participate when they go in. So again, we're going to be adding in more young people barriers if we take steps like that.
And that's an added financial barrier as well to, an increasingly tricky climate where we've already got so many barriers in terms of,
Mm.
cost of living crisis, etc. So that is worrying, isn't it?
It very much is. And also, it doesn't make any economic sense either, because when we've done the modelling on this with government, we've actually found that if we just take working age adults alone, current participation rates in arts and culture have roughly an 11-to-1 return on investment just for the well-being benefits that they bring
Yeah.
alone. So
Yeah.
if we start to put up barriers to this, we might feel like we're saving ourselves or making ourselves a bit of quick money, but actually we run the risk of cutting into these economic benefits that are already happening and actually costing ourselves a lot more money in the process.
Yeah, well, I was reading in your book as well that was it an 18 billion to the government
Yeah.
know that there's an 18 billion. Can you sort of expand on that for us? So there's an 18 billion.
Yeah, we were looking at if we monetize the benefits to well-being, to productivity, so the ability to work or do volunteering or caring, and also reductions in health and social care usage, then current participation rates amongst working age adults each year in the UK are worth 18.6 billion. And Wales just did a follow-up analysis of this where they said, well, we know we spend 28.5 million pounds a year on Arts Council Wales, and we know that that's according to those figures, generating 350 million pounds of health economic benefits just for well-being. So that's where that 11-to-1 return on investment has come through from those specific analyses in Wales.
I mean, that's staggering, isn't it? Absolutely staggering. And so, despite the government sort of knowing this and sort of having all of this data, why do you think there's still sort of there's almost like a blockage, isn't there, of actually, acting on some of this information?
There is a blockage. I think bizarrely it's more ideological than actually evidence based because if you look at the evidence, it doesn't make any sense to ever cut any funding for the arts. It would make more sense to be investing more. But I think it becomes ideological, kind of forgetting the evidence and just thinking like, do we value arts? But that's where I find it slightly harder to get my head around because as someone that looks at evidence to make decisions, then allowing perhaps emotional or personal preferences to rule this starts to make a lot less sense.
Yeah, yeah, I totally get that. And I think that moves us into an interesting point which your book made, which I'm going to quote, which is you spoke about how artists must now not only build a brand but be available 24/7 in this sort of full-time, hyper-competitive occupation obsessed with clicks. I think that absolutely hits the nail on the head. Um, and I think even with all this effort, many artists are still not making ends meet. Um, do you think that arts careers should receive more investment from the government? And I mean, Ireland, for example, have just
Yeah.
a pilot. Can you sort of delve into that a little bit for us?
Yeah, the island has been a really interesting pilot because they've done the first universal basic income for artists. And over the last couple of years, they've had, I believe it's around 2,000 artists who've participated in this, where they've been given them a basic income. So they haven't got to worry about making ends meet in the same way, but then asking them to carry on with their artistic practice. What they've actually found when this happens is artists don't sort of rest on their laurels. They're actually more productive. They've been taking more creative risks and producing more innovative work in what they're doing. And they've also had much better mental health and well-being in this time. And when again they look at the economic return on investments, every euro they've put in has generated around €1.37 in return, which is a really decent return on investment. So now they're actually making this a more permanent scheme. But it actually also has implications beyond the arts because artists are facing a kind of precarity in their working conditions and issues around pay and reliability of income that actually a lot of workers are going to face over the coming couple of decades as AI takes a greater hold on doing a lot of jobs. So actually the issues that feel like they're kind of confined to certain sectors like the arts are about to start affecting a large proportion of people. So
Yeah.
seeing these benefits of providing universal basic arts income actually also builds into much bigger arguments about universal basic income, which we won't go into today, but I think just highlights how the arts world actually has this bigger relevance to the whole of society thinking as well.
Yeah, I mean, that's something that we at Fashion Roundtable have harped on about for years and we've advocated for. So it's nice to have that pilot sort of starting to come out of Ireland because it's something that we can all draw on and,
Hmm.
use as evidence, which I think is important.
Hmm.
And then I think sort of another thing that was really interesting in your book is that a solution that you give is for sort of arts prescription. And I know this falls under the social prescribing umbrella. And an artist in Wales wrote in and said, art is not just an add on when other basic needs are met, it's what makes us human, its core. And I thought that was a really
I love that.
interesting, yeah, way of looking at it. And another person, Charles, wrote in the same vein and said, "Your book, which he very much enjoyed, points out benefits of art in healthcare. So, how close are conversations or even just attitudes within the NHS to embracing these lines of thought?" You able to answer that?
Yeah, it's a hard one because I actually started my career in hospital arts, like I mentioned. So I sort of saw how this worked within hospitals. But yesterday I was along at the National Arts and Hospitals Network in England. And I was really hearing that actually, far from us being further along in our understanding of the benefits in hospitals and the kind of acceptance of this over the last 10 years since I left that world, it's actually got harder. We're actually seeing that hospitals are making more cuts to their arts programs, even though the evidence is even stronger than a decade ago on this. And I think this is underlining the sort of repeated challenge that it's not about the evidence at the moment. It's coming down a lot more to sort of ideologies, or whenever again there's tight budgets, you cut the arts bit first. So I am concerned about that. I think there are other sort of more national programs like Arts on Prescription through social prescribing that have alternative ways of working rather than hospital by hospital models. But even then, we're seeing a lot of challenges at the moment. Again, around the conversations about who should be paying and sort of trying to pass around the responsibility for which department should be covering the cost. So it feels like it's very precarious, which I think is the same for lots of discussions about the arts sector as a whole. But I guess it's also why it's so important that the books come out now and we're having these discussions, because it does feel, as you said at the start, really timely with everything that's going on.
Yeah, it feels to me like there's all this evidence that says, that there are all of these health benefits on the one hand, but then there's all this pulling the plug on the funding on the other.
Hmm.
So it's sort of a continually underfunding the arts sector. Would you agree with that?
Yes, I very much would.
And can you expand on sort of what art prescribing might look like in practice? Like, how would a GP, for example, like take us into, I don't know, say we're in the
How it
future,
works.
this is lovely, and GPs are now using these art prescriptions as regularly with patients. How does that look?
Well, it is already happening regularly. So at the moment, technically, anyone that goes to their GP, there should be the ability for them to be passed on, referred to a link worker, who's that person that knows all the activities in the community, whether it's arts or other kinds of community groups or supports, and can spend time with the patient talking through their needs, their goals, their access, and the kind of logistics of getting there, and then can support them into engaging. Technically, anybody can go to their GP and request access to that service as it is. But actually, we've been tracking the rates of this, and there was a service that was expanding massively over the first 4 years from when it started rolling out in 2019. And actually, in that first 4 years, this program reached 5.5 million patients, which was 6 times the number that the NHS and government had anticipated would access it in that time. But then the numbers have actually been falling since then. So there is a little bit of an issue going on again around not getting the continued investment in the way that had been hoped, or the same kind of prioritization, even though the evidence is increasingly showing again strong returns on investments and numerous health and well-being benefits for those who participate.
Yeah, that's interesting. So do you think it's funding cuts in that sort of realm, or do you think it's sort of
I
lack
think
of
it's
training?
I think it's funding pressures, and then even when people say it's important, it somehow keeps falling lower down priority lists. And we keep talking about needing to have a left shift to think much more about prevention and to thinking about neighborhood health and these sort of buzzwords and concepts that are talked about a lot. But then when it actually comes down to where the funding actually gets put, that can be the more challenging aspect. Ideologically, people often seem to be in support of this, but that doesn't mean they're going to be willing to take the actions to make it happen.
Yeah, that's really interesting. And I think the other thing that was really interesting about your book is you spoke about not only sort of all of the health benefits, but also like what are the impacts of like arts deprivation on
Mhm.
communities.
What I really do at the end is I flip the whole thing around and say we shouldn't be arguing people need more arts in their lives. We should be worrying about the risk of arts deprivation, because if people don't have regular access to the arts, they're actually at an increased risk of depression, dementia, chronic pain, age related physical decline, behavioral problems and developmental problems, and even premature mortality. And actually, by allowing arts engagement to be unevenly distributed within and between societies, we're arguably exacerbating health inequalities. So I kind of want us to think about it from that perspective, because as soon as you start to talk about it in that way, it really like underlines that this is actually something that's quite fundamental to be discussing in relation to health.
Yeah, I mean, I felt quite emotional when you flipped that part of the book around and you started talking about premature mortality and all of these things. And then we've got I know for a fact that there are issues with funding in this space, and wouldn't it be lovely if there wasn't? And I think I think if we are looking into the future, and if the government came to you tomorrow and said you could have sort of any sort of wish list of policies that you want, anything at all in terms of, arts participation, well-being, um, could you give us some of your short and long-term policies?
I would love to see there being a kind of lock on arts funding. We've had locks on things like pensions in the past from government. And I think that having this agreement that arts funding is not going to be cut, or even that there'll be certain rules to ensure that it continues in line with whatever rates of inflation or whatever, something like that is really important. So it's not just seen as the quick fix whenever you need to plunger a bit of money to support another sector. I also think it's really important that we think about more joined up funding streams. Some of the challenges in social prescribing have been that there's been funding for link worker roles, but not necessarily for the community activities to refer people to. And we really need joined up approaches, particularly given the fact that investments from one source often leads to returns on investment for other departments. Therefore, it kind of needs to be a pooled approach if people are going to really appreciate those returns on investments. And I think particularly schools feels like such an urgent priority. So we've had some sort of lip service to the idea that arts might be revitalized in the education curriculum. But I really want to see like some numbers attached to this. I'd love to see there again ring-fenced funding to support the training of teachers and to support the provision of arts within schools so that all young people have guaranteed access.
Yeah. And then sort of like more longer term. So are they your longer term sort of that's your sort of wish list? In the immediate, what could the government do? So in terms of, short term wins that would make, big impact, is there anything that they could look at?
I think short term, the curriculum one is a really key one. We've just had a
Yeah.
curriculum review. We've had a government response to it. Well, that's two big steps in the process. So now there's the third step of actually making a tangible commitment. Same with social prescribing. Again, we've had it again discussed as being of value and importance in the new NHS strategy as part of neighbourhood health. Okay, we need to actually assign budgets to this now so that we can be guaranteed that this work can continue.
Yeah. Yep, that makes a lot of sense. And I think they're not massive requests either, are they? You're
No, and actually
asking.
the amounts of money are very small compared to amounts that go into other kinds of programs. I think particularly when we're seeing a lot of money that's going into things like additional runways, for example, things like that. But there are economic returns on investment from going into arts as well that also align much more with priorities around things like environment and climate change too. And it feels a shame that we're not going for those ones, yet we are going for other ones where it's arguable if they're going to have the benefit that are being discussed in relation to them.
Yeah. And would you have anything ring fenced around AI? Because I know we've spoken about that in terms of policy.
I think that is an important one as well, like trying to ensure that AI is not allowed to use artistic products to train itself on at the moment. And
Yeah.
I think also thinking about how we're reimbursing artists, given we've had such strong evidence coming back from Ireland about the universal basic income, why aren't we rolling this out across parts of the UK as well? Because that feels like, it feels like a sort of quick win to be able to do that, given those results that have just come out.
Yeah. And it's almost, I think the other thing is sort of what do you think is lost when the creator is not human in terms of these health benefits? I think that's the other angle, isn't it?
Yeah, a lot of arts is about the human connection that occurs. In fact, things like singing are thought to have partly evolved as a way of supporting social bonding within communities as a crucial survival skill. So yes, it makes sense that we are maintaining that human connection in it if we're really going to realize the full benefits.
Yeah. And then in terms of sort of government policies, what about like you mentioned sort of community funding? I know your book kind of goes into, so you've got the social prescribing, then you would look to sort of release funding into more of those community groups. What kind of community groups would you like to see in that realm?
I think we're really lucky that there's such a strong grassroots movement within arts and health. There are so many artists and arts organizations delivering work. I think we really need to maintain diversity in this because a big thing about the arts is whether people have access to opportunities that meet their own cultural backgrounds, their own personal preferences and tastes. So it's really important that we're not forcing kind of potentially high arts definitions on what we think is going to be the most important arts for people, but rather there are lots of different opportunities for cultural expression within communities. So I think allowing this to be driven from the bottom up rather than top down imposing what we think this should look like is really crucial. And I do think spaces is important here. When there are spaces to do arts, people can organically mobilize and put things together, even on voluntary bases, which things like book clubs are run by individuals who want to have that kind of program in their communities, but you really need those spaces so that there then isn't a financial barrier to local groups being allowed to establish themselves.
Yeah, I agree with you. We did a briefing and event in Parliament a while back on unused retail spaces and using, vacant spaces for these bottom up sort of art, participation, sort of community engagement.
I love that idea.
So actually, yeah, another policy then could be looking at sort of social value leases or opening up these vacant spaces for communities.
I really think that's a wonderful idea because that feels like it's sort of a win for everyone. It's one of those
Yeah.
ones that I'm not an expert in why this doesn't happen already, but it's one of those ones that feels illogical that we're not doing that already.
Yeah, I know. It's totally illogical. But yeah, wouldn't it just be lovely if like this wish list just got ticked off and we had access to all this amazing stuff within our communities.
Well, I mean, I do think we should be optimistic. I think, things are really difficult at the moment. We need to be frank about that. But actually, we've seen that over the decades, other health behaviors sort of have their moments where suddenly there's a lot more talking about them, a shift in public perception, kind of shift in government policies as well. Physical activity sector has done this really well, and kind of leisure sectors in arguing and ensuring there are leisure centre spaces, and also that there's public awareness around the importance of engaging. But that was, a shift of its own right that took place a few decades ago. I do think that the increased awareness we're seeing around this topic now is really helpful and supportive to trying to get a similar shift in awareness and support for arts and cultural sectors too.
Yeah, totally agree. And then it comes back to what you were saying about arts participation being the fifth pillar of but the World Health Organization are going to recognize this as a fifth pillar. Is that correct?
We're in the middle of a roadmap with World Health Organization where we're trying to head towards a technical resolution acknowledging the value of the arts as a health behaviour. So this is a process that involves various briefings and reports before that full resolution. But it's one we've been working towards positively over the last few years, and we've got a kind of schedule of how we're going to get those things to pass. So I hope that that kind of high level endorsement that we have coming through from WHO helps to position this in a kind of validated way with policymakers as well, showing this is also something that's got that high level support. And UNESCO has just come on board to have a kind of similar process with them around raising more awareness about the benefits that the arts have within policy.
I mean, that's incredible. And so, could you just tell us a little bit more about your role with WHO?
So I direct the WHO's International Collaborating Centre for Arts and Health. So we have a specific remit to work with WHO to provide technical assistance when they're working on international policy. And I've also just been designated the UNESCO Chair for Arts and Global Health, which is really nice because it's now a kind of similar responsibility with UNESCO. So we've now got the international health body and the international arts body both coming together and working together on this work, which I think is a really major step.
Major, yeah, and I think big congratulations. That's such a massive achievement, um, and so all of this research is coming at such a crucial time. And obviously, your book's out now. So, is there anything else you'd like to share about your book before we finish up that you'd like people to know?
Well, I guess just to say, if people are interested, we've got a whole series of live events relating to the book happening around the UK as well, including actually quite a lot happening in big theatres where I'm speaking alongside kind of leading figures from the arts world to discuss a lot of these issues. So, of course, if people are interested in coming along, they can. But it's also if you've got an MP or you've got a key stakeholder or funder where you want them to be involved in this conversation, this can be a really good way to bring them into the picture and to help them understand more why this topic is so important.
Jodie in the chat has written, "Thank goodness for people like Daisy, gives me hope."
That's very kind. I'd say really thank goodness for the artists who are carrying on delivering this work, even in the face of such big challenges at the moment, because without artists doing this, we're really lost. So I'm really grateful for all of the artistic work that is still happening and hoping that we can try and get the environment to change to support it more.
Yep, totally agree. We've just asked if there are any more questions um, from the audience. And so where can people buy your book? So it's available we're
It's
going to
available anywhere. I would always say try and support an independent bookshop if you can. So there are places like bookseller.org or Hive, which are
yeah,
wonderful websites because the money goes directly to independents.
Yeah. So we'll put some links at the end of this session. We'll put some links. Obviously, this video will go out to all of Fashion Roundtable subscribers, and then we'll put a link to Hive Books, who's an independent bookseller. Cool. I think we're going to wrap up. It was absolutely lovely to meet you and have a
Really
chat.
wonderful to take part. Thank you so much for all the questions from the audience as well.
Brilliant. Oh, thank you so much, Daisy.
Lovely to join you.
Oh, bye.